Tonight's speaker is Dave Ferguson, who's Mr. Local of the world, and he's going to be talking to us about the dry fruit and prickly pears of New Mexico. So take it away, Dave.
Have at it. All right. First, I apologize for the delay. And what we're going to be talking about, Steve, pretty much. No, that. Okay. We're going to be talking about prickly pears that don't have usual.
You're fine. Someone just got there.
Okay. I wasn't sure if we were waiting for some connection or. All right. Anyway, I scrolled forward a little bit here to get a fruit in the picture. And this is an example of a dry fruited prickly pear. So that you see that the fruit is kind of shriveled up, dry. They're usually brownish or pale tan, maybe almost white sometimes, or if they're really old, they'll turn black. But sometimes before they ripen fully, they'll turn a little reddish, and they might fool you a little bit into thinking that they're going to get juicy. But the fruits dry really quick. In our climate here in Albuquerque, they usually bloom around late April, May, and the fruits ripen fairly quickly. So the fruits often are ripe by the end of July. They're falling on the ground and mice are eating the seeds out of them. So this dry fruit is what holds this group together, and they're all very closely related to one another, and they differ from almost all other prickly pears in that the others have the juicy fruits that we all call tunas. So I'm going to blur your eyes here a little bit and go back to where I started. Okay, so there actually aren't too many of these in New Mexico, but they're confusing. Sometimes they can be confused with other species that don't have dry fruit. But a lot of the year, if you really look around the plants, you can find bits of those dry fruits or even whole dry fruits sitting around the base of the plants. And often they're spiny, more often than not. And most prickly pears don't have much in the way of spines on their fruits. This group usually does. Sometimes the plants are almost spineless, and then the fruits might be too. But usually they're really spiny plants. They have wonderful flowers. They're really popular in gardens because they tend to be small in size. A lot of them are real compact in habit compared to your average prickly pear. So where a big one of these might get 3 feet across in 10 years, as compared to a huge bush or an 8-foot monster that some of the others make. And they're all really cold hardy. Even the ones from the southernmost part of New Mexico, even ones from Southern California, Baja, and Mexico can take a lot of cold. And so they're really popular with cold hardy cactus and succulent growers. Some are easier to grow than others, but mostly they're pretty easy to grow. I put them in here alphabetically just to make it easy. So the first one is, I'm going to go species by species and just show pictures of each species. The first one is Opuntia arenaria, and it's a species that grows in sand in south central New Mexico, and in Texas in the El Paso area, and then down into Chihuahua, maybe 100 miles. And there's isolated pockets that the cows haven't wiped out yet, almost west to Deming. And it's a cute little plant. This looks like a lot of them, but the pads on this particular plant are only about 1.25 inches long. And so those little dry fruits, you can see them there. They're just laying there. I'm not going to get into it too much, but you all may have some questions later. One way that these species are distinguished is one that you can't see unless you are in a laboratory. and that is to look at the chromosome number. Cactus have, I don't know, that one picture keeps coming up in the wrong place, but anyway, cactus have 11 chromosomes in one set of chromosomes, and without getting too detailed, almost all living things that at least that have sexual reproduction in chromosomes have 2 sets of chromosomes in each cell. Now, sometimes these are duplicate sets, but sometimes these are increased in number, and you can have diploid, which is the lowest number. So in cactus, they have 11 chromosomes in one set, but normally they'll have 22 chromosomes in each cell. There's 2 sets. But sometimes they can be polyploid, which means more than the base number. So they might have double that. They might have 44. They might have triple that. They might have 66. They might have 88.
What does that do to the species? Or any?
Well, generally, within a species, I keep forgetting which is forward. Within a species, the number is usually constant. Not always, but usually it's constant. So Aranari is a diploid. It only has 22 chromosomes. There aren't many counts made yet, but nobody's found any higher number.
Will the critters go after the seed pods that fall? Oh, nice.
Well, yeah, the mice eat the seeds, the seed pods roll around, they get stuck on animals' legs and their fur like cockleburrs.
How can a cow eat something like that?
Well, ask the cow. I'm not gonna try it.
How can he eat it?
Well, cows will eat a lot of things that you wouldn't expect. Cows can get addicted to eating choya. So anyway, there's a rabbits, gophers, mice, deer, javelinas, all kinds of things. Here's a pen next to Arenaria. So while we're lingering on Arenaria, we're covering a lot of other things. One thing that this group tends to do, but not all species, is grow rhizomes, especially when they're growing in really shallow soil over rocks or when they're growing in sand. And Arenaria is well known for having rhizomes. One way you can tell it's a rhizome is, look, there's areoles with glochids on them, and it's underground. And that's a stem that grows underground, and then it'll pop up maybe 2, 3, 4 feet away and make a new plant. When you see them, unless they're in a row, which often they are, you can't tell they're the same plant connected. It's a different way of reproducing that most cactus don't do. But it's kind of like a strawberry plant, except it's doing it underground. So keep going the wrong way. Anyway, moving on. Arenaria is small, usually has yellow flowers. Most of the rest of them can have all sorts of different flower colors. And that's another wonderful thing about growing them in a garden.
I got a question.
The foot doesn't always go with them, though.
I was gonna ask, who in the world looks for cactus in their bare feet?
Well, it's in a pot. Come on.
It's your foot.
Who would do that?
I would have to be a contortionist for that to be my foot.
Oh, whose foot is it?
It's probably one of my kids when they were little. I got a lot of photos that were photobombed, so a lot of them were accidental. Some of them have cats in them, you know. Anyway, this particular plant's kind of interesting. I just threw it in because if you look at the plant behind that flower is actually only about 2 inches across, but it looks huge. The plant behind it looks like Arenaria, but it comes from the dunes in central Utah, and it has this color flower. It's probably an undescribed species. And that's part of what makes this fun for me, but it's not New Mexican, so you only get one photo. Opuntia debrexii is one that gets it's causing all kinds of controversy now because people hate the name. A lot of people won't admit that it's real. It grows in like 9 states. It's somewhat variable. It's nice. It has fairly large flowers, 2-3 inches sometimes. And it gets confused with the Opuntia fragilis. It's a small plant. The stem segments are usually around 2 inches, sometimes 3, exceptionally, sometimes smaller. And it can be anything from spineless to having several heavy spines. And it tends to have these kind of lumpy pads, especially the new ones. And the areoles are kind of far apart. And when it does have spines, there's usually not many per areole. And it's called Debrexii. And that's I forget what country that was, Czech. I don't remember, Czech or Russian or anyway. This plant has a long story behind the name, and I'm not going to tell you the whole story, but for like over 100 years, people called it Opuntia rutila. You may have heard of that. It was a common garden plant. Everybody knew where it grew. People love to grow it. It's easy to grow. It breaks apart fairly easily. But a lot of people confuse it with the smaller Opuntia fragilis, and I'll get to that shortly.
Flower color is peach.
The flower color can be. It's a little variable. Here, now I'm jumping ahead a little bit. On the right, this is a dwarf variety of polyacantha called Schwerwiniana, and this is Debrexii, and they're growing together. And they're about the same size. The joints on this plant in the wild were about 1.5 inches, and on this were about 2 inches. So they look bigger than they are. The color is all over the place. So there's that dry fruit I showed you. It was on a Debrexii. Here's a spineless cultivar.
I got one of those.
Some people call these little potatoes. Some call them denudata, some call them enormous. They come in different colors, but they're not really fragilis. I've only seen one fragilis that was spineless. Mostly they're Debrexii.
Yeah, I got 2 of those.
So the color is quite variable, and the flowers are quite showy. And the flowers are a lot like most of the others. They're like I said, 2-3 inches on a little tiny plant. Usually there's one flower at the tip of the stems.
That's peach.
Yeah, they can be beautiful. This isn't a common color. You have to look around to find this color. But you can find just about anything between yellow and magenta, including two-tone. And one thing about the polyacantha group, which is the dry fruited species,
Now that's the same plant?
that's the same plant.
All those different colors.
They're not really different colored flowers in this, if you look at the history of the flower, because this flower is a new flower that opened yellow. This is later.
Like some roses.
This is, yeah, a lot like some of the roses, the mutabilis type things. And here's an old flower that's about to close, and here's some that are all the way gone. Now, when the weather's hot and intense, a lot of times they'll open this color, they'll be this color till afternoon. They'll turn this color and they're closed and they're done. But this was taken in Idaho in a garden. And this is 1 day, this is 2 day, and this is 3 day. That's about all you're gonna get. Still Debrexii. So, and that's another Debrexii fruit. They can be spiny or spineless. Depends a lot on the plant itself. So the next is Opuntia fragilis, and it's a little tiny thing. This is a full-size, mature, normal plant. This wasn't actually in New Mexico. It was in eastern Colorado, but it varies a little bit in spine color. The flowers aren't very big. 1 inch is common, 1.5 inches, 2 inches is a whopper. They break apart. You sneeze on them and they fall apart. And the spines are barbed. If you walk through them, they're all over your shoes. They tend to be growing often on the plains when I was a kid. Not so much anymore because they're kind of dying because of all the ranchers and their herbicides, but and the farming. But you'd walk along the fence lines on the Great Plains, and they'd be all along the fence lines in a drift under the fence line because the birds would wipe them off on the fence, the cows would wipe them off on the fence, the sheep would wipe them off on the fence, and all the little pieces would fall to the base of the fence and grow.
Where do you find them in New Mexico?
In New Mexico, they're in the northern part of the state, and they're only rare. They're scattered. There's a population near Inscription Rock. There's some scattered north from there in sandy areas, usually in ponderosa pine, sometimes out in sagebrush. There used to be somewhere they built the airport in Santa Fe. Somebody found one by a lamppost in Albuquerque once, but I think it was probably not natural there. It was growing out of a hole in a sidewalk. They grow south in Texas about to Amarillo. They grow east on the Great Plains, just barely into Kansas and Nebraska. They go all the way north to the Yukon. And they go to British Columbia, Northern California, and Wisconsin, and Ontario. So it's one of the widest ranging species of cactus in the world, but it doesn't like to be hot. So you won't find it in El Paso or Phoenix. And I didn't mention where Debrexii grew. It only barely, the one before this only sneaks into the state up kind of north of Farmington, up on those mesas near Mesa Verde. It's the only place in the state I've ever seen it naturally.
Dave,
Yeah.
the first teaching job was in Moses Lake, Washington. And I shot ducks over an island that was entirely fragilous.
Yeah.
But no spines. And
Oh, really?
And I looked for seeds, most fruit for the 4 years I lived there. I never found a seed.
They don't bloom a lot, but another thing is the way they break apart, they reproduce clonally. So sometimes the whole population will be one individual plant. So likely a lot of the populations on the edge of the species range are only one plant. So like you might find a colony in Ontario and it might be one plant. So even if it blooms, it might not make seed because a lot of these plants require more than one individual cross-pollinating to set fruit. It's very rare to get seeds when there's not. Some species are a little more, it doesn't matter. They set fruit no matter what. But most of these dry fruited ones don't. So here's one with fruit. They're not quite ripe. They're a little bit red. This was actually in the cactus garden in the parking lot out here. But this is one that has been called black cat because when the spines mature, they're black. So the spine color can vary a lot on all of these species, and it makes a huge difference in how they look. I'd never seen a spineless one from Washington, but I've seen a spineless one that came from Colorado.
Yeah.
And people grow it in their gardens, and it's teeny tiny little thing. Yeah. And the other thing is the flower on Fragilis, as far as I know, it's always yellow. I've never seen one that wasn't yellow. I've seen them with a red center, and I've seen them with red stamens and no other red. And sometimes they turn kind of peachy right before they close. But I've never seen one that wasn't yellow. So if you find one with a larger flower that isn't yellow, it's probably not Fragilis. So
do the advertising for the things?
they can, but I don't think it's very common. I think it's a lot more common in gardens where things are kind of unnatural. So now I got to figure out what varieties what. Most of the rest are Opuntia polyacantha, and it's the common one. It's almost statewide, spreads across the ground. Most varieties have joints around 3-4 inches across, 3 more common. There's a dwarf one that's only 1 or 2 inches. But the most common variety around Albuquerque and from here to the west is variety Hystracina, which has fairly long spines. It's pretty shaggy. The spines vary a lot. They can be 1 inch or they can be 4 inches.
What species is this?
Polyacantha.
Variety history.
Yeah, a variety. This is the one we saw out at Rio Rancho the other day. We brought a cutting home that had white spines. Sometimes they're black. The flowers are all over the place. I mean, that's what makes them so wonderful. You could go out there and find all these different colors in one spot. But you go to another spot and they're all the same color. So it just depends on where you are.
Is there a particular plant, Dave, that, you know, that's smaller, probably, I don't know, maybe not any bigger than a tennis ball, but it bloomed white?
Well, there's a couple of these that people have found that are almost white.
No, this is cloud white, cotton white. I mean,
Well, I'd have to see the plant to know what it is that you're talking about. But, and I keep forgetting the chromosomes too. Debrexii, so the first one, RNRA, was diploid, 22 chromosomes. Debrexii, as far as everybody's found so far, is hexaploid with 66. Fragilis is hexaploid with 66. This variety of polyacantha, and as far as I know, all of them are tetraploid with 44. So if you could have a handy dandy pocket chromosome counter, that would kind of help identify them, but nobody's invented one yet, but they're getting a lot closer. They vary a lot. This one's kind of leaning towards another species and they can be confusing. So yeah, they do tend to attract the bugs. It's fun to watch them. It's fun to get out there with a video camera and just those are little tiny beetles. I don't remember the species, but this is the next variety. This is variety polyacantha. Or wait, no, that was still Hystracina. Sorry. I should remember my alphabet, right? The next variety is Juniperina. And it was named because they found it growing with junipers up near Cedar Hill, north of Farmington. And it's a variety that isn't very spiny. And this variety tends to grow up in the mountains, often in the woodlands. There's a bunch of them up on the Sandia Crest. They blend, these varieties blend wherever they meet. But over large areas, they tend to be fairly pure. So it's kind of like that's part of being a variety. If you're part of the same species, you're able to mix with each other. Basically, they're races. So this one, what's that? They're like races. Varieties, just think of them as being races of plants or animals. They don't use variety. Anyway, this one's just as varied in flower color, but more often it's yellow. And usually the spines on the lower part of the pad there aren't very many of them or none. And often there's none on the fruit. But look at that flower. See how it's kind of all tight with lots of close together leaves, and there's not much space in between, and it's kind of fat and round. That's kind of typical for these dry fruited prickly pears. Most of the juicy fruited ones, this bud, once it gets this size, is kind of elongate and it has more space between the areoles. So even when there's no fruits, a lot of times you can tell by looking at the new growth that the new pads are kind of like this too. They're real tight. Everything's kind of close together usually. So this is actually, I think I took this one on the Sandia Crest. Sometimes they're spineless. When I first found a spineless one when I was a kid in Western Colorado, I was like, I found a beaver tail in Colorado. Wow. It wasn't a beaver tail. It was just one of these. It had yellow flowers. But beaver tails are related, but they don't occur naturally in New Mexico. And there are Opuntia basilaris. I didn't throw any pictures in, but they have naturalized. There's a few places where you can find them vacant lot down near El Paso and Las Cruces. The one place I knew of where it was reliable and they'd made a colony, there's houses now, so, oh well. So they vary a little. I mean, what variety is that? That's over near Quemado, and it may be a unique variety that needs a name, but it kind of fits variety polyacantha, which is the Great Plains variety. And that variety usually has one main central spine that's kind of stout, and it's usually not much over an inch long, but they vary a lot. Generally, if it's out on the plains, it's variety polyacantha. Now there's one that's pretty close to white, but it has a red center. This is a cultivar that came from near where I grew up as a kid. It came from near a field right outside of Big Springs, Nebraska, and they sell it as Crystal Tide. And a guy named it's very winter hardy.
Yeah.
It'll probably take 60 below if it's good and dormant.
Yeah.
And I know for a fact it'll take 45 below because it got that cold up there when I lived there. So anyway, this was growing in a field where we used to go to watch fireworks in the summer on the 4th of July. So there wasn't much there then. It was all driven and packed and nasty, but it was the same spot. But a guy named John Cipra, who sold cold hardy plants and lived in Smithwick, South Dakota, found this plant. And he collected a lot of other Opuntia cultivars that are cold hardy that we grow now. One's called Smithwick. It's a hybrid between Fragilis and a juicy fruited species. So this is polyacantha, variety polyacantha. It's in the winter. The dry fruits. Some of these have been kind of worked on by mice. A lot of times these seeds, you'll find them laying around and they'll have a little hole in the side and they'll be hollow. And that means the mice found them. They actually eat the inside of the seed out and leave the outer coating. This is who knows what that is. Cochineal's right. The spider, some of the mites can look a little like that, but they usually don't get that fuzzy. So if you smash that, it's purple, and I hate it. It does damage to my plants, and I don't like it. But there's people that grow it. Right. It was what's that?
Is the top plant unrooted?
These are all cuttings that I took, and they were all from the same population, just different spine colors. This one has fairly long spines. And these are all from out on the plains. So if you go out someplace like Santa Rosa or Tucumcari or Clayton or Raton, this is the variety you'll find out there. Or even just over in Estancia and Moriarty. And the flowers are amazing. This is actually one that I took a picture of in South Dakota. This variety, there's a pocket of it over near Quemado in the San. My brains are not working. That flat area that's out there where the array is. Yeah, the San Agustin Plains, and then again east of the mountains, and a little bit up towards Taos, and then it goes north to Alberta and Alberta. And Manitoba. So we're just at the southern limit. And flower color again, just amazing. Usually these are yellow or magenta. Anything else is kind of lucky if you find them. But they're out there and they're not rare. The yellow is often orange or red in the center. The red a red one or a magenta one or an orange one might be green or yellow in the center. So they're really variable. And nobody's ever worked on the genetics, but I'll bet it's really fascinating. So this is a variety that I don't know if it's actually in the state or not, but I've seen some plants that I'd call this up near Shiprock. And it's a variety that it kind of looks like Debrexii that's been blown up and the pads made flat and wide. See, the aerials are kind of far apart and it kind of looks kind of green. Spines are kind of heavy and there's not many of them. When it shrinks down in the winter, though, it can look pretty spiny. But this is what was named Rhodantha from up near Grand Junction. And it's had a few names. Benson called it Utahensis, which was a different plant from Nevada that looks a little similar. And this has been a common garden plant for 200 years.
Wow.
They've been growing it in Europe since the Germans came and found it in the 1800s or early 1800s. Colorado Plateaus mostly is where they got it, but it sneaks into New Mexico, just right up there, just above Shiprock. Oh, in Germany, they just grow it in gardens outside. You can buy it in nurseries there. You can buy a lot of these in nurseries there. Sometimes it doesn't have very many spines either, and it's kind of hard to tell from Juniperina. But the pads tend to be lumpier with fewer aerials, and the pads tend to be thicker.
That's a serious thing.
Yeah. So this isn't a gorgeous plant, but it gives a pretty good idea of how they look on average. When it's not blooming or when it doesn't have fruit, this is really easy to confuse with some of the ones that have juicy fruits. It's a little smaller than most of them. A 6-inch pad on this would be humongous. 4 inches large. 3 inches probably average. And a lot of these turn purple in the winter. It's really common. They'll turn purple in the winter and then they'll turn green in the summer. It's kind of an antifreeze thing going on is the main theory. The betalain pigments are increased and the moisture content is lowered. And I think the chlorophyll drops in.
The color changes maybe because the chlorophyll disappears.
Well, I'm not sure in this case that all the chlorophyll really does disappear,
Not all of it.
but that would be interesting to know how much does. But if you take one of these pads that's laying flat, flip it over, the underside will be green. Unless it's a purple plant. Some of them are just purple. So there's another one with varied flower color in this particular variety.
Wow, that's amazing.
I mean, you go walk around out in the desert or in the hills, and when they're blooming, you can find some amazing plants.
These are still pollinated.
Yeah, these are all. This is Polyacantha variety Rhodantha.
Where is this?
Well, some of these pictures weren't from New Mexico. Some of them were from Idaho. Some were from Utah. Some from Colorado. Or that's where the plants were from. I mean,
Are some of these, I mean, are a lot of these grown locally? I mean, are there
people.
stores that-
There's a lot of people have them in their gardens, but the nurseries around here don't. You don't see these, not much. But if you go online and look up the hardy cactus sellers, a lot of them have these for sale.
Wow.
There's another species that isn't in New Mexico that's called Opuntia aurea, and it's usually spineless. It looks a lot like this particular variety, except it's usually spineless and it has more aerials. And it comes from over in the Arizona Strip. And there's a guy named Kelly Grummins in Denver who's been hybridizing them. He hasn't really been hybridizing them. He's just been crossing arias and getting seedlings. And he's got some with amazing flowers. And he's also got a line that he's developing that reblooms.
What's
But-
the Arizona Strip?
Okay, that's the area north of the Grand Canyon and south of Zion, basically. It's a strip of country that's kind of isolated from the world around it by the Grand Canyon and the mountains, and not as much as it used to be. It's turning into retirement haven
Off the strip.
because it's narrow and long.
Is it?
In Arizona, they call it the Arizona Strip. In Utah, they call it the Utah Dixie
Oh,
because you can grow palm trees in part of it. It's warmer.
It's kind of like the Gaza Strip that's in the.
Yeah. It's also it's that country where the where the extreme Mormons live.
Question here.
Yeah,
Yeah,
You
are
tell
the
me that-
standard color below the pollen holders vary in Rodantha?
yes,
Cause I've got, mine are deep magenta, I've had that plant since I lived in Utah. And, it's such a red color in the center because
Yeah.
the pollen, little yellow pollen grains on the end are reds.
yeah, all of these varieties that have varied flower color, the stamen, the filaments can vary in color too.
Okay,
And the center of the flower, the base of the petals or tepals, people argue whether they're sepals or petals or both or neither. The base of the petals can be other colors from the rest. And so you can have like here, this is a good example. Let's assume this hadn't faded yet. And this is yellow out here and this is red in here. And then these stamens, the filaments could be green. And you can get like 3 colors or 4 colors in the same flower. But the pollen, as far as I know, it's pretty much always yellowish or yellow. So like here, it's hard to see, but see those filaments look kind of greenish. But then you come over here and they're dark pink. They changed color, just like the flower did. So there's the potential for breeding in these is probably endless. It's probably just amazing what could come out of these. Can you imagine crossing these with some of the nicer juicy fruited species? Anyway, keep getting to this and then turning back. This one is called Snowball. And this is a Rodantha that I think a guy in Grand Junction collected it, but the original place it was found is nobody seems to know. And I think he's still alive. I need to ask him. Anyway, this one is almost spineless. And that flower, I was trying to push the point. That flower is almost as white as they come, but it's actually pale yellow. The only true whites I've seen were on Basilaris in this group. And that's a magenta flowered species. The only true white cholla I've seen was on ones with magenta flowers normally. But yeah, you can get pink and this is darn close to white.
Yeah, I got one plant with yards. Cholla.
So
I got from Steve years ago.
this is a dwarf variety, a high elevation variety. You saw a picture of it over on it was over here on the right side and Debrexii was over here on the left. I actually took that picture near Meeker in Colorado. I don't know anywhere where the two grow together in New Mexico. But this variety grows up high in the mountains, sometimes 10,000 feet. It comes into New Mexico in the San Juan Mountains, and it might be in the Sangre de Cristos, but I've never been up there to look. And it gets down into the San Luis Valley, and there's vacant lots in parts of Taos where it grows right in town. And it just looks like the other varieties. If it's spiny, it looks a lot like variety Hystracina. And if it's not, it looks a lot like variety Juniperina, but it's little, it's tiny. And it doesn't get big when you put it in your garden. It stays tiny.
By tiny, you mean an inch?
Well, this flower is a little over an inch, but yeah, the pads are like an inch or 2.
Yeah.
And it's called variety Schwerwiniana, named after, I don't know if it was named after our Schwerin or not. I don't think it was. I don't think it was named after him, but it might have been. I'd have to look it up. I should have looked it up. Anyway, this one is kind of a Southern Rocky Mountain specialty. It's in Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, Southern Wyoming, and I've seen some that might be this in the Black Hills. It does blend with the bigger ones when you go down in elevation, and where these varieties meet, it gets all mixed up and confusing, and you can't really put a name on them. They're just polyacanthus something. And here's the fruits off of that. Those are millimeters. I think this was off of that. I might have mixed it up. but they're not very big. They're almost as long as the pads on the plant are, though. So this is a really common cultivar. Let's see, what's it called? Something gin. Now I'm blanking the name on it. If I could see the caption, I could read it, but there's some of this in the cactus garden out here in the parking lot. This is got a flower that's about the color of that thumbnail right there. Flower's about a little over an inch across and it blooms like crazy. And it's almost spineless. Here's the seeds off of it. Look at the size of those seeds. For a plant that's got pads, that's off the same plant. The pads are only like an inch and a half, and here these seeds are, some of them are a quarter inch.
Are those seeds edible, Dave?
Well, edible maybe, but I sure wouldn't think they'd break your teeth if you try to chew them.
Not like pumpkin seed.
They've got a hard outer coating that's really hard. Now, you might be able to make a flower out of them or something, but I don't think that outer coating is. I don't even remember what kind of tissue that is. I should know, but I think it's cellulose.
Would you have to like crack that or scuff it or something in order to?
Well, they'll germinate without, but if you do scar it or crack it, they'll germinate easier and quicker sometimes. Usually fresh seeds, like if the fruit's still not quite dry, the seeds will germinate real quick.
Oh, okay.
And then if you let them set too long, they enter some kind of a dormancy. And then you can put them in a pot and sometimes they'll come up 10 years later all on the same day.
Well, you can soak them, dude.
You can try soaking them, but I never had any luck with that. I forgot a batch of fruits and soaked the fruits for a month. They smelled horrible. And I pulled the fruits out, cleaned the seeds, and the seeds were still fine, and not one of them tried to germinate. So, but I think with this group, I think it might require some freezing too, or at least that helps. Age and freeze thaw, I think, is the key. But you could try gibberellic acid. You can sand them. You can crack them. If you crack them, you're liable to damage the embryo. So you got to be really.
Sulfuric acid.
Sulfuric acid might work. I wouldn't soak them too long.
They're close.
Then just aging them. If you plant 10, 15-year-old seed, a lot of times it'll just come right up.
It's just.
Yeah, and a lot of times it's totally dead because it's died 10 years ago. So you don't know unless you crack them open and look, or you try to grow them. So let me get my bearings here. I'm moving on to Opuntia trichophora, which is the grizzly bear cactus of our region. It's kind of like the Ursina of the Mojave. And usually, but not always, it has hair-like spines. Sometimes, like on this plant, they start out kind of short and not really obviously hairy. But then when the plant gets old, they get longer towards the base. But I threw this one in as an example of some of the uncertainty. So all those previous polyacantha varieties, as far as I know, they're all tetraploid, but so few sampling that nobody knows for sure. Trichophora, all the samples they've taken are diploid. So they have half as many chromosomes. Odds are they're older as a species. They may be a parent to polyacantha and some of the others, because the chromosome number easily can go up, but it doesn't go back down again very easy. But the thing about this plant, this is from down. If you look at this and you think back to the variety polyacantha, this looks a lot like it, a heck of a lot like it, to the point where you couldn't be sure which one you're looking at if it's in a pot. But these grow down below Roswell and down into the Trans-Pecos. And when they're out in the flats, they tend to look like polyacantha, and when they're up on the rocks, they tend to be shaggy, hairy, like most trichophora are. This one's hairy, but it's got short spines. It's nice and neatly groomed. So, but these are diploid. And they blend with the hairy ones. So there's a lot of work to be done to really understand these. Are these polyacantha before it became a tetraploid? Is it really the same thing? Could be. Is Trichophora just a hairy ancestral polyacantha? The thing is these diploids, a lot of times they grow with other varieties that have a higher level of chromosomes. And when they grow together, they usually don't mix it up. The hybrids happen, but they're pretty rare. And when they do happen, they usually won't make seeds. They're usually sterile. So anyway, even the fruits have these kind of flexible, slender, almost hair-like spines. And sometimes they get really shaggy. This one's up near Santa Fe at the top where this was described from. Back by Engelmann. He described it in 1856. This one's in the same place. They get better than this. I didn't throw in enough pictures of this one because every now and then you'll find one that has spines that are like 6 inches long and just cover the whole plant. But I threw this together kind of haphazardly about an hour ago. I'm not gonna tell you the whole story, but I had a really bad day. And I forgot it was Thursday. I mean Wednesday.
You sure
No, I'm just making my point. I had no idea what today was. I was just out in the zone. So anyway, that pretty much wraps it up for the pictures of dry fruited New Mexican prickly pears or New Mexican dry fruited prickly pears.
Does this variety bloom?
This is Opuntia trichophora. So a lot of people put it into polyacantha, but because it has 22 chromosomes instead of 44, and because sometimes it grows right alongside of other varieties of polyacantha and they stay different, most people call it a different species now, and I do. I consider it a different species. And you can.
The only known color.
What's that?
Is yellow the only known flower color?
Yeah, that's a good question because I didn't bring it up. Polyacantha, all the varieties can have multiple flower colors. And so can several of the other dry fruited species. But Arenaria, Fragilis, and Trichophora, as far as anybody knows, as far as I've ever been able to find, only have yellow flowers. But Fragilis and Arenaria can have red centered flowers. And I found one plant out of all the millions that I've seen of Trichophora that had an orange center in the flower. And I don't know if it was because the flowers were 2 days old or because it was really orange, but it was growing up on the side of a hill above T or C. And all the others had normal yellow flowers. And boy, were they hairy, fuzzy, nice plants. But this one is kind of statewide, but it's not really out on the plains except in the northeast corner where all the lava rock is. It tends to be where the terrain's broken and mountainous. But then down in the Trans-Pecos and down towards Roswell and Alamogordo and that whole area, it'll get out in those flats. And a lot of times those flats are kind of sandy, and a lot of times they're gypsum flats. And so I don't know, there may be more than one thing involved in what we're calling trichophora. There may be more than one different thing involved in a lot of these, but nobody's spent a lot of time really in depth studying. That was a horrible sentence. There's a lot of work to be done, and we're like 100 years behind in what we should know. And I don't want to, this is just me, but it goes contrary to what a lot of other people think. A lot of people think everything in Opuntia is a hybrid. Well, when I go out and I look at them in the field, what I see isn't hybrids. I see distinct populations that are actually usually pretty easy to tell apart. And they grow with each other, and the hybrids between them are pretty darn rare. There are hybrids, and there are a few places I've seen where they break down and they go crazy hybridizing in a small area where several species might be involved, but that's not very common. One place I know is near Pueblo in Colorado, and another is near Kayenta in Arizona. And they're just little tiny areas. They're just, you could measure them in hundreds of acres. It's kind of like the Huria Mountains for Echinocereus. You don't normally find a lot of hybrids. You have to hunt for them, but they're out there. They happen almost everywhere where two species meet. But usually the hybrids are sterile, or they don't grow very well, or they just aren't reproducing. Now I'm going to pull a flip-flop on you. Hybridization is probably one of the main driving forces behind how all these different kinds develop. Things exchanging genes back and forth and recombining and changing and evolving and adapting. And after millions and millions of years, you get a lot of different populations. And a lot of those populations share a lot of the same ancestry. And that's just the way it works. It's that way with all living things. So to me, that's not hybrids. They hybridized and they shared genes, and that happened here and there. And it was just one of many factors in them becoming what they are now. Just like with us humans, but I don't want to get into that. That's dangerous territory.
Are there areas like in the state, I mean, where some of these cactus exist that are designated where you could go and recover some? I mean, are they?
Well, most of the state is either government or private property, right?
Okay, yeah.
So as far as if there's a development project,
Right.
or something like that, yeah, you can often arrange to go salvage plants. Private land, you have to ask the owners.
Right.
On federal land, you're supposed to have a permit. So it depends on where they are and what they are. And here's another thing I didn't mention. Opuntia arenaria in the US is in serious danger of extinction. Its primary area where it grows is south of Las Cruces and the El Paso urban area.
Along the Rio Grande.
Near the Rio Grande, and all that sand. Most of it's houses and buildings and farms now. It's mostly gone. And out west towards Deming, where it used to grow spotty out in that sand country, if you've ever driven across that country, it's all blown into little dunes that piled up over the last century in the mesquite bushes. It's all destabilized, and the cactus are almost all gone. But if you cross into Mexico, there's places where it's dirt common. There's still plenty of it. But it
buried by the dirt or what?
well, where the cows were, it got trampled and eaten, buried by the dirt. It can't grow in active dunes,
No.
but it does grow on sand that's stabilized. It can grow where the sand blows some. It'll get buried and grow up through the sand. But if it's getting buried every year by 6 inches or a foot of sand, it's not going to survive. Or if the sand blows out away from it, and there's not much, it grows in a very small area. So it's one of the few really endangered plants in New Mexico. And it's a prickly pear. And it is on the state rare plant list. I don't think it has any federal protection yet that I know of.
And when we say babies,
Breeders,
rabbits on diameter.
Well, it's easy to grow. I mean, there's some out here in the cactus garden in the parking lot. But it's also easy to rot. In a pot, it rots at the drop of it. I mean, you drop one drop of water on it and it's dead.
I had that.
You soak it and it's fine. It grows like a weed. So
The plants out by Rear Ranch are mostly polyacanthus then?
the dry fruited plants are in the whole Albuquerque area. As far as I know, there's nothing here but polyacantha.
Poly.
East of the Sandias, out in the grasslands, it's poly. Up high where they aren't very spiny, it's juniperina. And out here in the desert or desert grassland or whatever we call our shrubs and sparse grass around here, it's hystricine. And the Sandia Monzano Mountains, and kind of the Sangre de Cristos are kind of the dividing line between poly and polyhystracina. But where they get through the gaps, they mix it up real nice. So, like you get up there north of the Sandias, out in some of that country between Santa Fe, it's like up on the Guyanas.
Yeah.
One plant looks like juniperina, the next looks like variety polycanthum, the next looks like hystracina, and they're all growing in the same population. Plant the seeds and they come up all over the spectrum.
Where you collect pads from here and there and everywhere and see what you get from God.
Yeah, but it's a highly variable complex and it's really fun. And it's probably one of the most varied within species of all the prickly pears. But that's what makes it fun.
How does anybody, including yourself, distinguish, how would I say, parent plants maybe, the original?
Takes experience.
That's,
I've got to represent the biologists. Okay, I gotta say something.
Okay.
Okay. If two plants have different numbers of chromosomes, they're different species. That's absolutely true. Absolutely true.
That's a
No,
philosophical
it's not.
argument.
It's chemistry. Okay, the only reason, a plant can suddenly become from diploid to tetraploid, and now it's a new species. It's not true that it takes 1,000,000 years to make a new species. It happens in one generation. The only reason, and if you read Darwin, he didn't say that it's because he didn't know about genes when Darwin was writing. The guy that invented genetics, named Mendel, a monk in Austria, actually sent his first paper to Darwin in the mail. When Darwin died, they found an unopened envelope in Darwin's papers. So it took another 30 years after Darwin died before somebody listened to Mendel and said, hey, you know what, there's something to this.
Well, for the most part, I agree with you. It's more complicated than that sometimes.
And by the way, there are lots of people still alive today, like David Hunt is one of them.
Oh, they don't pay any attention to chromosomes at all.
Absolutely nothing to do with science, chemistry. They go back to, what's his face, the guy who invented biology, essentially, Linnaeus, Linnaeus.
He started the
He started the,
nomenclature.
Right.
the definition of a species, according to those people, is something which you can determine by a genetic tree, by a tree of characteristics. What's his face? David Hunt wrote someplace I read years ago that he does not want to hear the word chromosome or ploidy in anything that you say to argue that something is a species. He wants a key.
Hunt's gone now, but he's well thought of, but he did not tend to look at chromosomes. Right now, chromosomes are even getting to be passé. It's now DNA.
right.
They're digging even deeper.
Yeah.
And there's all kinds of philosophies, and this could be a discussion that, well, it is a discussion that books are written about. For the most part, with almost no exceptions, I agree with you.
I'm sorry, I'm actually a trained organic chemist. I retired years ago. And I have the organic chemist point of view about this stuff.
Yeah,
Well, I'm also a biologist as well, and there's a lot of areas that went undiscovered, and especially from chromatology and DNA. So there's a lot of stuff we're still learning that, but nobody is passing back.
yeah, and there's groups of plants where there are not many of them, but there's some groups of plants where the number doesn't make a bit of difference. They'll cross with each other and then make fertile offspring, and it doesn't matter if this one has 100 and that one has 52. They just, as long as there's enough of all of the important ones in there.
I actually
But
agree
that's
with
an
you.
exception.
Yeah, those are rare exceptions.
That's definitely an exception. Cactus are amazing because even one with 12 as a set is an abnormality. They all have one set is 11. It's amazing for any family of plants.
Yeah.
They're amazingly constant.
Dave, what I was asking is, with all the variety and the, you know, crossing and so forth and so on, and different, you know, species, is there such a thing in the applicable world as the parent plant, or a tree plant, you know, a root, that this is where this plant created all of this?
Go back.
There might have been 50 or 60 million years ago.
I mean, is there such a book that has
Nobody knows.
that kind of thing? in
All
it?
you can do is guess what it might have
Or they
been.
just cross them down much.
They don't, the thing is they don't cross that much. They cross some, but no, it's almost, you could probably do it with DNA after we know enough about DNA. You could kind of say this one came before that one and is more like, this one's more likely to be a parent of that one or vice versa. But right now, it's pretty much just guessing. But when they start doing when they start doing the whole genome, all the DNA in the cell, and they're doing that now, if they start doing that with Opuntia, they're going to start sorting out into groups. And it's going to be a mess, but it'll start sorting out and it'll be easier to understand who came from who. But you can't go out in the field and say this and that are the parents of that. You can guess that it might be that way, but even if it is that way, it might have happened 50,000 years ago. Yeah.
You better wrap it up.
Yeah, I think we could talk like this forever. Are there any more questions directly related to the talk? I don't know how much time we have. 2 minutes. So 2 short questions. If anybody has any, if not.